Murphy. I work for Pratt & Whitney Canada, which is part of the United Technologies Group. I have been in aerospace for 6 years, but automotive for 20. So I've got a lot of experience with APQP and PPAP. So if there's any questions at the end, obviously, feel free to ask.
Good morning, this is Larry Bennett. I work at GE Aviation. I'm a principal engineer. I have just celebrated my 30th anniversary in aviation, aerospace, and delighted to be a part of this webinar today. Today you see we are going to cover the PPAP section, and we have some backup slide information for you as well as part of the presentation.
Okay, I'll be taking part of the first part of the webinar here. So really, the APQP and PPAP webinar series is to introduce and give better insight into the new AS 9145, and depending on your area, that can change, but 9145, which introduces advanced product quality planning. Inside of advanced product quality planning, there is a fairly complex process and use of a variety of tools that this webinar series has introduced. So it's really to give that high-level understanding of how those individual tools fit into APQP as well as PPAP for production part approval process. I'm also going to show you, and Larry will show you some of the benefits and best practices that have already been adopted, and any additional information we'll be able to try to push through. Next slide. Okay, next slide.
Yeah, I'm trying to get there. I'm advancing as quickly as I thought I would.
Okay, so some of the things we're going to look at is obviously a linkage between PPAP itself and APQP, the key concepts and benefits of PPAP, including the planning phase, which is part of APQP and is extremely important. We're going to do a quick overview of the different requirements for all of the elements within PPAP. Many of these have had their own webinars, but we're going to do a quick review of those. The relationship between those different elements, because we have what we call core elements. Then we're also going to talk about the FAI for first article inspection as well as PPAP, because there are some similarities. There are some questions sometimes around this one as to duplication, and we're going to try to cover that. And we're going to also at the end of it talk when we should submit PPAP as well as when we should resubmit PPAP. And lastly, some reference information, because there's a wealth of information that's supplied by the SCMH. The picture that you see here has been in most of the different webinars that you've seen, and this is because the top curve is the V formation for basically APQP. So everybody should be fairly familiar if you've looked at the other webinars. And the boxes below, we've worked our way through all of the different webinars and the different phases of APQP. And you can see here that PPAP is really just the culmination or the completion of all of the different elements inside of it. So this box was really meant to elaborate that the overlap of PPAP isn't at the end of APQP, but is done throughout all of the phases of APQP. Okay, so really, PPAP itself, production part approval process, is really to give confidence that the supplier has all the necessary information to produce the parts, okay, that they've reviewed all the information and they know that they comply, that they prepare the start of production so that when we enter into production, we're providing good parts right away, and that they're capable of conforming all the key characteristics that to a capability of 1.33 CPK. And really what this means is as we move forward, that the idea is that the first parts that come into production, we reduce the number of QNs or the number of complaints that suppliers will receive from customers, and that it allows us to move forward with a minimal impact on the assembly of anything for final production. Inside of aerospace, there are some differences. So we recognize that although APQP has been in other industries for many years, there's definitely some differences in aerospace and defense. One of those is low volumes compared to, for example, automotive, where we're talking millions of parts being produced. To an aerospace and defense, it could be 1, 10, 100 parts that are being produced. The life cycles are much longer. Again, an example of automotive, it's based on 10 years approximately for most vehicles, whereas for aerospace engines, we're talking 30 years. So there's a much, much longer one, and as well as the level of regulation from all of the different government bodies. So there's a lot of different complexities for that mix of low volume and high mix. Okay. And lastly, that feeds into, as I was discussing here, with a high mix and low volume. And then it's really an engineering to order. So many times in aerospace, we have a customer who is requesting things that are much different or are very demanding as the industry evolves. So here we're trying to look at how we get the part and process family approach. Okay, so with a part and process family approach, what we can do is, you'll see with many of the different elements, we can take advantage and have families of products for, say, PFEMAs and that, to cut down on the amount of work we're doing for every individual part. Because PPAP is applied at a part level. However, we can look at it and say, how can we bring in these families to help reduce the amount of complexity around the work required, and that we're not just doing paperwork here. So really, if we can look at part and process families here, it gives us a definite benefit, and there's a lot of information within the PPAP and the 9145 that allows for these part families to take place. So from here, I can hand it over to Larry to take the next slides.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about PPAP and APQP and what these terms mean in a little more detail. So when we talk about PPAP, we're talking about a production part approval process. And what that is, it actually confirms that the production process has demonstrated potential to produce products. So when we look at this slide, we think about consistently fulfilling all requirements while operating at customer demand rate, which becomes a challenge in itself. But when we think about this slide and we think about PPAP, think about it in this terms. We want to deliver all the time, on quality, on time, on cost, every time, all the time. And the PPAP process allows us to do that because we've satisfied all of the requirements that are going to allow us to get to a customer demand rate. And when you think about a PPAP overview, you can see here that it shows the 5 phases, and you can clearly see that. And in this, you'll see that you're talking about the product development process. And then your blue line towards the bottom there, you're actually talking about when elements should be happening. And recognize that no one size fits all. This is a guideline. This has been, developed over time. But again, as we said, every organization is a little bit different. They have their own uniqueness, if you will. But one thing we can certainly say that's always true, and anytime we're trying to do an approval process, is the earlier we start, the better the results. Planning is always the key to success. And it's really no different when we're talking about PPAP than we are with any other type of initiative trying to satisfy customer expectations. So in summary, 9145 is the internationally harmonized aerospace standard. IAQP principles are keys to success, and you see the pillars there that allow us to get there. Deliverables and milestones that are aligned to each of the phases. PPAP approval is the output of advanced product quality planning. And APQP and PPAP apply throughout the life of the product. It is a living process, and management of change is absolutely vital to the success of a quality organization.
Okay, so when we look at this, we're going to talk briefly about key concepts of PPAP, and this one, for the most part, is fairly read by slide here, but it's really, PPAP is a collection of records. So APQP happens throughout the entire design and the development of both the product and the process. And PPAP is really just the collection of that information into one source, which becomes a submission package. So PPAP is not something that happens at the end when we ship products. It's not just paperwork at the end, but really it should just be a collection of that information that all comes together when the PPAP is due. It also defined all of those standard deliverables that are required. So the elements are very standardized. So what we expect for each part is very, very clear. First article is included in that and is part of that production validation. So there is an element for FAI, and as we move forward, there are teams within the industry that are looking at pulling both the FAI and PPAP even closer together to make sure there's no duplication. And then all the elements should be updated whenever there are process or product changes. So there is a resubmission. So if we look at PPAP, it's quite often referred to, a lot of the documents within it are referred to as living documents. Or even after submission, these documents they stay active so that if there's any changes within the process, that remains accurately describing what the current process is. Okay. So on this next slide here, you see that we compile the PPAP package throughout the phases of APQP. There is a submission to the customer. This may be slightly different from customer to customer. And then there's a disposition, obviously, of approve, an interim, or a reject. So really, we start to collect these different documents that will collect into it against the PPAP, starting in phase 2 of APQP. And once we hit phase 4, if you want to consider it a gate, basically, before we go into production is when that information is submitted to the customer, and you need to receive a formal PPAP approval before you ship the product. So really the idea is that we know that the product has been verified and validated before the first parts are received by the customer. And this, you'll see there's a reference there to 9145, section 5.1. So if there's more detail that you want to read into it, it's definitely, it's an easy read, section 5.1 in 9145. Okay, so really from a standpoint of PPAP is when should we apply it? Well, the main marks there are risk, complexity, contractual terms, so if your customer is asking for it, or also if there's prior part quality issues. So if we see that, we always like to look at that as a customer. We're looking at, say, has a certain type of part, has a certain supplier. If you've had issues on that, those are all key items where we may apply PPAP. And really the APQP activities and deliverables are established by the customer based on that complexity, risk, and those requirements, even that may be pushed by their customer.
Okay, so let's talk about the specific PPAP elements and some of the requirements associated with those. So you can see here on the page, we show 11 deliverables from a PPAP package as defined in AS 9145 Table 2. This is taken verbatim from that Table 2 of the standard. And you can see that each of these records are aligned with the APQP phase at which they are intended to be executed. I would also mention that there is a checklist for each phase in the Supply Chain Management Handbook. And so it shows you a roadmap for each phase and what should be accomplished in each one of those, and a checklist to show that you are making adequate progress. Let Brian talk a little bit about design records.
Okay, so as we walk into the individual elements here, you'll see the element 1 is design records. This element takes place in phase 2 of APQP, and really it is the recognition that the supplier needs to submit some type of a copy of the release supplier drawing or specifications if they're design responsible. And if they're a build-to-print supplier, really they're making sure that they're providing evidence that they're building the part to the correct customer drawings and revisions. So this whole element, it can be handled in many different ways, but the idea is to make sure that the parts that are being built for production meet the intent of what was being submitted by PO or other applicable document. Okay. The design risk analysis, and this is a very short review of all these different elements, obviously, but the design risk analysis is also taking place in phase 2, and the objective of it is to ensure that there's some type of a rigorous and thorough evaluation of design risks, that these provide accurate and timely flow out of the product key characteristics to the next phases of APQP. So if your organization is not design responsible, then your organization is not responsible to complete this element. However, this element may be something that's supplied by a customer to you if you're built to print. So the design risk is still evaluated by the customer in this case, and they're going to give you part of the key characteristics and everything that take place as watching what was found during the design as maybe some weaknesses or areas that need to be watched during the production process, and also areas where we may try to design out in the process things that the actual part you couldn't design out the risk. Okay. Part of that, as I said, is the design FEMA. This is the preferred method for design risks. I know here at Pratt, and we're also pushing this at industry level, is that the design FEMA is a very good tool, because basically what it does is it looks at it and it says, what are all the failure modes, but what are also the effects? It goes through and it verifies the occurrence and the detection, and then that will correlate back to what the actual severity was, and will give you what we call an RPN, or risk priority number. This risk priority number will help to establish a target and allow you to look at what your highest risks are from a severity standpoint, as well as what your highest overall risk is. From that, key characteristics can be developed, as well as changes to the design to be able to bring that and reduce those numbers to acceptable means. Once the design FEMA has been completed, that allows us, and this is where the supplier really can take a look at their process and say, how am I going to build the product? So this is happening in APQP phase 3. And basically, there's many different ways to develop a process flow, but the diagram really is just a sequential steps of the process itself. It's looking at the manufacturing process, and it can include operations from receipt all the way through to storage, packaging, and shipment of the product. So it's very important to make sure that we cover the movement and loading of those operations, because most of my history tells me of a lot of the errors that we see happen and a lot of the damage that we see happen is actually happening in those steps, not necessarily in the actual manufacturing step. So the purpose of the process flow is to help people see what the real process is. The overall visual diagram of it and the table will give you the inputs and outputs, showing to allow you to understand what is important as it comes in. So maybe there's key characteristics that are important for that actual production step and that have to be met before it comes in, as well as what these production steps give as key characteristics going into future steps. Okay. From a standpoint of APQP methodology, the activity should start once the preliminary design has been released, and it should be built upon until the process flow is completed in phase 1. It's critical that this happens prior to the PFMEA. So when we walk into the PFMEA, if you do not have a process flow completed, then you don't have the basis to be able to start looking at what a process FEMA will allow you to track through, because you'll be missing operations. Operations could change. It's very important that we have to have that before we go. And as part of the core tools, I would say, of PPAP and APQP, this is one of the documents that we call as the living document. So once it's released, it always should have changes in place as we move forward. Okay. The process FEMA is probably one of the most important core tools that we have in PPAP or APQP. It takes place in phase 3. And it is a structured method for identifying all possible failures and impacts of the process. Okay? It looks at the manufacturing and assembly processes even a final product or service. So really what we want to do is we want to look at the failure modes themselves, meaning the ways that, or modes in which something might fail. Failures are not not only errors, but are also defects, especially ones that affect the customer and can be potential or actual. So we're not just looking at failures that are occurring, we're looking at, is there a potential for it to occur? Then we look at what is the effect analysis. So that's referring to the study of the consequences or effect of those failures. And then the failures are prioritized, again, the same as the DFEMA, according to how serious their consequences are, how frequently they occur, and how easily they can be detected. When we get to the end of it, there's a reaction plan that will allow us to eliminate or reduce failure modes with high severity occurrence or poor detection. When we use it, so when launching a new product or service, design and development of new manufacturing processes, when we need to improve existing processes, when we're conducting root causing. So even a FEMA can be used during our root cause and corrective action events. It's a slightly different way. And again, it's a living document, so it's always used throughout the entire life of the product. And the objective is really to identify all of the potential product-related process failures, okay? We assess those potential effects of the failures, we identify the causes, and we plan preventions and mitigate and control of the failures. And one of the most important things for the TFMEA after it's been completed is it's a repository for lessons learned. So this means that we can always have a history of why we did it. When we complete a PFMEA, the initial time, any actions that we take to reduce the severity or any actions that we take to reduce the RPN will actually be listed on the right-hand side of the FEMA, and therefore we have that ongoing history. One last point that I wanted to bring up is that it's extremely important for the process FEMA to be cross-functional. So this means it's not just written by one person, it's really a cross-functional team of, say, manufacturing engineers, production personnel, so people on the floor, quality, design engineering, maintenance, and they don't always have to be in every single meeting, but it's a very important thing to be able to look at it and say, who do I need for these sections of the FEMA as I walk through it? And that's the process FEMA.
Okay, great point you mentioned there, Brian, about this being a cross-functional exercise. Absolutely vital. I've been involved in a number of FMEA activities, and I can tell you without question, the most successful ones are those that have a cross-functional, and it's not just manufacturing and quality, it's cross-functional, meaning that you've got operations and you've got maintenance and you've got sales. It really is bringing in many different voices to be successful. Just can't stress that enough. So walking on through the core tools, and you can see we're identifying a number of core tools here, and as you would imagine, we have separate webinars for each one of these as well, and that's why we do that, is because of the importance and the significance of each one of these tools. And they're absolutely vital to the success of the whole APQP process. And so as we walk through a control plan really is taking, in a nutshell, the outputs from the design efforts you've done, from the design risk analysis and the design FMEA, identifying key characteristics, walking through a PFD and walking through a PFMEA to identify what are the key risk areas, and then putting a control plan in place to manage the expected variation or whatever you might get from a process realization. So walking through some of the key points from the slide, it's a documented description that links manufacturing process steps to key inspection and control activities. The intent of the control plan is obviously to control the design characteristics and the process variables to ensure that we have consistent product quality. It is a document that describes measurement methods, tools, and procedures required in each significant phase of the process. And objective is obviously to after the risk have been identified, that we are mitigating them, we're managing them, we're controlling them, we're identifying variation, And anytime there's a process change, we want to make sure that we're evaluating the process to make sure that it is still operating as we would expect. And as Brian mentioned on a couple of other tools he's covered already, this one is a living document. If there are changes in the process, and if we're realists, we know that change happens all the time in a variety of ways, and we get a variety of results from that change. And so the control plan has to be a living document that's revised and updated in response to those product and process changes. And when to use it, it's used to monitor all product and process key characteristics and critical items defined by customer and internal organizations. And it is intended to manage process variation and define reaction to out-of-control situations. So I would leave this slide by saying there are 3 core documents that are excellent communication tools: the PFD, the PFNEA, and the control plan. And you can use those at any time to show status and control. If anybody in the organization, internal or external, wants to know what's going on, you can show them those 3 tools, and they should get a clear picture and understanding of where you are in terms of process and change. Then we walk on to MSA. This is accomplished in phase 4. And an MSA, a measurement system analysis, is a statistical tool used to determine if a measurement system is capable of accurate or precise measurements. So kind of, let's just walk through a scenario. Let's assume we have a great CPK. Let's assume that we're always having conforming product. So the underlying question is, are we measuring correctly? Is there validity in the results that we're obtaining and the confidence that we have through our CPK and measured product? And so that's really what we're trying to do, is ensure what we measure is consistent every time. And it quantifies the variability and error added by the measurement system, and it discovers areas where we need training, procedures might be lacking, standards might not be defined. And then obviously you see an important takeaway in the left-hand box. An MSA addresses precision, whether the answer is repeatable and reproducible with partial information on accuracy. Calibration, absolutely critical to fully address an accuracy situation. And then initial process studies, a collection of dimensional results on product and process key characteristics that have been identified in the control plan. And you see here that less than 1 is not satisfying design expectations. We try to shoot for 1.33. Even with wiggle room in the process, it permits us to capture potential borderline conditions. Now, we all understand that 1.33 CPK is difficult to attain. And I think Brian would attest to the fact that I believe the automotive is even tighter. I think it's 1.67, which is a full sigma tighter than a 1.33 that the aerospace is trying to accomplish. So not trying to minimize what's being accomplished, but just trying to put it in relative terms that it might be a stretch goal, so to speak, but it's certainly what the industry is trying to get to on a consistent basis. And so again, the objective is to take initial process capability studies and demonstrate the combination of all of the 6 M's, if you will, have the potential to produce product that will consistently meet the design requirements. Products produced from production runs are used to provide data for determining this initial process capability. Packing, preservation, and labeling. The first thing I would say is part marking sometimes gets grouped in this section incorrectly. Part marking is actually applied in the customer-specific requirement section, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but it does not belong in packing, preservation, and labeling. So here we have labeling is one of the biggest issues from a customer perspective. Just think about wrong facility, wrong location within a facility, incorrect inventory accounting and accuracy. We're trying to prevent damage. We're trying to prevent degradation during transit and storage. And so that's what this section is trying to do, is ensure that we understand what are the potential touch points and then having a mitigation to handle all of those known or perceived or expected issues related to packing, preservation, and labeling. So we want to ensure the product or material is not physically damaged. We want to make sure the packaging doesn't degrade in performance. And we want to make sure that the labeling is used to ensure the correct product or material is received by the customer. Packaging should be considered early in the process design and thus is completed in phase 3. When required by the customer, a packaging evaluation is completed in phase 4 when product becomes available, and the producer should confirm that labeling requirements are understood and can be executed in phase 3. And then we talk about first article inspection. I think this area, it should be, I don't want to make an assumption, but this area should be well known and well understood. The first article inspection report is not something new. It's been around for a long time. And the couple of key takeaways I want to make sure you understand is in the bottom section, the planning should begin early. As I mentioned before, we can't start early enough with some of this planning. And we want to make sure that we're pushing data and information through the system. Rather than relying on somebody at the end of the line, go and find that data and try to pull it out of the system. We want to try to make sure our planning incorporates all the necessary ingredients and elements so that it's being pushed through the system, and when they get to the end, everything's there in a nice package for somebody to collate. And the FAI submission shall be completed using the initial production part produced during the first production run. Absolutely vital to the integrity of the first article inspection process. If the part's not representative of production, we really haven't done anything other than say this part is acceptable, but if it's not a part of the initial production run, then it's not representative of production. The role of FAI is obviously, FAI is part of PPAP. FAI is approval of the part, and PPAP is approval of the process in regard to future product. The FAI is a one-time look, but the PPAP is trying to make sure that we can meet customer demand rate over time, all the time, more than just an FAI. And then lastly, on customer-specific PPAP requirements, this is one of those that's kind of, I'll just say, open-ended. We're trying hard as an industry to try to better coordinate so that we don't have a lot of customer uniqueness. But again, it's a little different with everybody being different from an organization standpoint. But we're really trying hard to rationalize behind the scenes of what are customer-specific requirements, and so we can try to identify on a consistent basis what those customer-specific requirements are. But these are very customer-dependent, occurs in phase 4, and it highlights part marking because, again, part marking is one of those things that no matter how much attention and energy we apply, it's still one of the biggest reasons for nonconformances and escapes within our aerospace supply base. So I just ask you to just continue to focus on that and make sure that your part marking processes and documentation and accountability within that is as robust as it can be. And lastly, we have a PPAP approval form done in phase 4. The primary purpose of this is retention, retrieval, and control. We want to make sure that we retain it. We want to make sure that we can retrieve it within a reasonable time frame, and we want to make sure that we control it. So we show all of the activity associated with the initial PPAP approval as well as any subsequent changes. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian and cover the next section.
Perfect. And this will kind of finish off. We've gone fairly quickly through this. This is the second time that we've done the PPAP. I've left lots of room on the back end for questions because I'm hoping, based on the first one, we kind of ran out of time. So I'm hoping this way it'll allow for a more question period. So when we look at the PPAP file and the submission of it, I want to list some key terms, I guess, so everybody maybe understands this. Is the PPAP file contains copies of all of the PPAP elements. And by that, I mean, this is where we start talking about living documents. is elements themselves, such as the PFMEA, they are actively updated throughout it. So the file is what is kept by the supplier, the manufacturer, and it is always would have the most current up-to-date copies that match the process. The PPAP submission contains all of the elements as defined by the customer, and there usually is a submission level. So for aerospace, we have several different submission levels. The standard is a level 3. That means that everything would be submitted to the customer for review. But there may be, depending on your level of proficiency, depending on the complexity of the part, a different level may be selected. It could be as simple as a level 1, which is really just asking for the approval, so element 11 itself, or it could be that everything will be reviewed on site at your location, which would be a level 4. So the submission is really just a snapshot in time of the PPAP file. So keep in mind that when you submit something to the customer, that's a snapshot in time. It's showing where you are today, but it does not necessarily represent what the PPAP file will be as you move forward in production. Okay, all of the elements may be requested for submission, and basically PPAP may be requested prior to all elements being completed. This means, for example, you may achieve an interim. It's impossible, for example, to calculate a capability when you've started shipping products to the customer and they've only received 1 or 2, and you may have only produced 3 or 4 possibly. And if that's the case, you can't, there's no way for you to possibly meet the requirements of the capability of the initial process study. So the customer may ask for PPAP approval to review the rest of the documentation and then give you an interim as we move forward. So approval statuses. We listed earlier in the webinar that there's a full approval, an interim approval, and rejected. So really, as you can see here, full approval obviously is going to mean that all of the associated document meets the customer requirements, and that basically the supplier may supply product or ship product to the customer as required. So a full approval is saying that the process meets, and the FAI meets the requirements for both the product, and the PPAP meets the requirements for the process. It's been approved by the customer. Interims may be granted based upon not all of the customer requirements being met. In some cases, there are certain ones that are always required, but capability, for example, is one. There are some others that will allow, like FEMAs and that. There can be open actions that are still required to be finished before they're finalized. These are all good things for interims. Product may be supplied, but it may be supplied under an amount of time, most likely, or even under an amount of pieces. So it's possible that an interim can be written to say you have 3 months until you have to resubmit, or that you can supply 10 pieces prior to submission. And there is always a resubmission required. If you're rejected, the product doesn't meet, obviously the product or process associated document doesn't meet all the customer requirements. You cannot ship product, and a resubmission is required. Okay, as I said, most common reasons for interims can be that sorting documentation has not been completed. So it could be that the customer is asking for more information related to certain areas, the limited quantity of production of parts. Testing sometimes, depending on what it is, takes a long time to complete. There may have been a conditional fair with engineering approvals for the deviations, but we're still waiting for a complete fair. And also, as I said, the PFMEA may have open mitigation actions. So some things are longer lead, and in some cases, we know, especially around the FEMA, that we have to reassess the corrective actions that we've put in place to mitigate that risk to see if they did actually mitigate it. So those are all very common reasons why you may get an interim. And there is a checklist that helps to establish that and helps you prepare it. And it can also be found in the Supply Chain Management Handbook. Okay, most common rejections. So customers require documentation to be submitted completed. So it's possible that you either haven't submitted something or it's not completed the way it is. The quality of the documentation, it doesn't account for all of those product or process characteristics. It may not include all of the different processes within it, which is why the process flow is so important. The variable data may not be recorded as numerical results. So we quite often will get suppliers that will just say that a part passed or failed, where we're looking for numerical values. And in some cases, even the missing or wrong information has been provided. So again, I would reference to the actual checklist for phase 4 if you have any questions or anything. This is probably one of the most important slides in this deck. You are not authorized to ship to customers unless you receive it in writing. So you need to have an approved PPAP. If PPAP is applicable to a part, you must have an approved PPAP, Form 1 or equivalent, depending on your customer. But if you do not ship products. So you always have to make sure, follow up with the customer, follow up again, follow up often, but verbal approval from a buyer or something is not acceptable. And lastly, one of the big questions that comes around is, when do I have to resubmit for PPAP? So obviously, if you have an interim status, there's always going to be a resubmission required. So as those elements are completed, they should be resubmitted. And depending on what it is, I would say there's no reason that you can't submit knowing, for example, you've updated your FEMA and resubmitting that to the customer to get feedback, even though you may not have produced enough parts for capability yet. So I would say talk with your customers, contact whoever your focal point is at the customer, and establish when you should be submitting here. But it never hurts, obviously, to be able to have an extra submission in there to review certain key areas, as I said, especially around the FEMA or something, even if you don't have the capability in check yet or enough parts to be able to do that. For rejection, obviously, you're always going to have to submit if there's any missing or elements themselves that have been rejected and turned back to you. And then, most importantly, resubmission of a PPAP when an FAI is required as outlined by 9102. So if you require to submit a new FAI, then chances are you need to submit another PPAP. So that's just a general rule is I would expect if you're submitting an FAI that you will be submitting an update for the PPAP. If there's ever any question around any of this, then just contact your customer and they can give you the information that is required for resubmission.
Okay, we're coming down the home stretch with the presentation materials, and so we want to conclude that portion of the presentation with guidance material and training. So this is a snapshot of the AS 9145, which was published in November of 2016. And we have the Aerospace APQP Supply Chain Management Handbook, Section 7.2, which has the introduction presentation. It has the APQP manual, which is we call them element cards by each relevant topic, and some best practices on how to handle and address each of the APQP requirements. We have phase checklists that we've referred to a few times throughout this presentation. We have tools and templates, and I would tell you that some of these have been posted just recently, some of them in December of 2019. So the industry's been working hard behind the scenes to commonize, if you will, all the templates, so that if you get a requirement for a PFMEA from customer A or customer B or C, you would expect to use the same template for it to satisfy each of those applications. Again, trying to drive out the customer uniqueness and make it more of a standard approach. And then I want to highlight the maturity assessment. If you haven't seen this tool, it's an excellent tool to see where an organization stands in terms of satisfying and meeting APQP. It goes through 5 core sections, and it asks questions to see where you are on the continuum of 1 to 5. And if you can get to a 3, I think you'll be right where you need to be, regardless of who your customer base is. self-assured here, so a little bit more about the maturity matrix. Its intention is to be able to identify gaps and show weaknesses. And so you can see here are the 5 core sections: management awareness and commitment, organizational alignment and effective communication, project and risk management, tools, APQP, the tools we've been talking about today, and then readiness of external support providers. And there are pointed questions with each of these sections to assess your current status and ability to be at an APQP readiness level. Some references for you. And a screenshot showing where all of the past webinars are housed. And then we want to highlight here that we do have a APQP survey. What we're trying to do is get participation and let us know where individual organizations stand in terms of what we can provide for you, what we can do to help you, and where you are in your journey. So we'd ask you to go into that SurveyMonkey application and provide us feedback. With that, I'm going to turn it over, I believe, to Sue.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Larry. We've gotten through all the slides now, and you have a good understanding out there of what PPAP's all about. And we do have some questions coming in, so if you want to stick around for a little bit, we'll be going until for a bit longer. And I think it's 10:30, and we will see if we can get some answers to some of the questions that are rolling in. Just to introduce myself quickly, I'm Susan Parsons, and I work for the IAQG, specifically the Product and Supply Chain Improvement Strategy stream. And one of our main products, of course, is the SCMH. So there's some general questions coming in about where can they find, for example, the templates. It kind of flashed through there pretty quick, but you'll see there's a circle around the webinar tab. That's where you'll find the webinars. Nope, just where we were.
Okay.
And yeah, go one more. So you'll find the webinar section, which in that section, after we do some reviewing of the recording, we'll post the latest ones there. So you'll have the whole series available to you, both the presentation, the recording, and depending on if we get through all the Q&A during the recording, we may even have a Q&A section published for the particular topic. But right next to that, you'll see that tab that says 7, Plan and Manage. All the APQP materials is found in section 7.2. You'll find all the templates ready for your use. You can change the logo. We want you to use them. And like it was pointed out during the presentation, that we try to get as many customers or primes or manufacturers to agree, the experts, on what should be in each of these templates so they can be used among and accepted widely among all of your customers. So that's where you'll find them. One of the first questions I have for the team here is for the panelists is, what is your view of a PPAP coordinator?
So for me, a PPAP coordinator is not necessarily the person who has to complete the entire PPAP, but they are the central focal point at the supplier. So I'll give you an example. For Pratt & Whitney, we have PPAP coordinators, but it's on the customer side. They are actually bringing in all of the supplier submissions and then are pushing out those to the particular quality engineers to review the packages. So on the supplier side, what I would expect is for a coordinator that someone knows the ins and outs of the company. So it should be somebody who knows who to go to. But for certain elements, as I said, DFMEAs, if you're a design responsible supplier, is usually handled and is, although it's cross-functional, is usually done by engineering. So it's going to be different people within the facility that you're going to go and see. So really a coordinator role for me is somebody who knows who to go and talk to for all of the different documentation, and then they can actually compile the package and send it.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I kind of see this as program and project management, you know, not a whole lot different from project and program management 101. Somebody's responsible to make sure that the big picture is being seen, and as Brian alluded to, know where to go and what belly buttons to find and what buttons to push to make sure tasks and objectives are being accomplished in the time frame they need to be.
Okay, thank you. This one's specific to our organization works on BTP, build to print projects. And how can we apply this process to our kind of industry where we don't own the design?
Okay, so this is actually, I think, something that you're not alone in. Most of the industry, I would say, is in a standpoint where they're built to print. So PPAP is, remember, all about the process. So the only real element that is design specific is element 2 for the design risk analysis or the DFEMA. So although you may not complete that section and it may be supplied to you by a customer, all of the other elements are relevant. For example, the process flow is going to follow what you do in your facility. It's going to follow the process that you use to make the part. The PFMEA is looking at your processes and the information or the manufacturing that you're putting in place. So most of PPAP is actually not around the designer or who's design responsible. So I think the greatest part of the industry is definitely, it is applicable, and this doesn't change, by the way, in other industries. As I alluded to at the beginning, I was in automotive for 20 years, and most suppliers are also built to print, and they complete PPAP. So I think the majority are built to print.
This is a sort of a carry on to that. It says, do I understand this right? At what level in the supply chain is PPAP, APQP flowed down? Is it as far down as the organizations that have design responsibility?
So that does kind of, I guess, flow the same way. So usually PPAP or APQP, depending, as I said, APQP, although PPAP is part of APQP, many companies, including Pratt & Whitney, have flowed PPAP longer than we have flowed APQP. So whether we call it the cart before the horse, at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, it can be applied as far down in the supply chain as needed. So I can give you a reference, and again, it's going to depend on who your customer is, but I can give you an example, again, that's close to my heart, is for Pratt & Whitney or for UTC, it will be applied to the supplier from our company, and our specification, which right now we are aligned to the 9145, and in the future, we're hoping to just completely eliminate any type of customer specification. Our specification states that it should be risk-based to the supplier and all members of its supply chain. So basically, there is value in the PPAP all the way through the supply chain. I would say you can use some type of a risk-based approach as long as it's approved by the customer. But I think people sometimes see PPAP as, I've heard the term before, please provide additional paperwork. And really, that's not it. At the end of the day, if everything is completed for the PPAP when it's supposed to throughout the APQP phases, then pulling together the actual PPAP only takes a matter of hours. And also, I guess one note along with that is many customers out there have actually required many of the elements of PPAP, including FAI, the FEMAs for like process failure modes, for process flows, control plan. Many customers have actually required those even before PPAP came along. So in a lot of cases, PPAP is, again, not additional requirements, but is actually just a validation gate of the items that are already required to be completed.
I think that's a very good point because, you know, if you're an aerospace engine supplier, you're familiar with the AS 13000 series of documents, AS 13004 for PFMEA. Some of those have been requirements for a number of years, long before we're now trying to push as an industry AS 9145 and APQP and PPAP. So to Brian's point, when folks come to me and say, hey, Larry, this is all new. Well, it may be new, but it's not a new requirement. It's just something that hasn't been given the attention that it deserves.
And just a clarification, as I'm reading through these questions, people are asking if how they can apply it when they don't have design responsibility. I believe you covered it, but if you want to clarify.
Yeah, so I guess, again, just to clarify, if you are not design responsible, that actually doesn't change anything from a standpoint of how you deploy PPAP outside of element 2. So really, the only design part of it that bars you from doing something would be element 2. And usually the supplier or the customer, I apologize, usually the customer would supply something to you either on the drawing as key characteristics. They may give you a separate document showing you risks that were found in the design that they would like you to look at. There's many different ways it could be conveyed, but everything else around the PPAP is process related. So it is really a validation of the production process, not the design. The only one that's specific to design itself is really the FAI.
Yeah, and I would add to that, you know, a make-to-print supplier is kind of on an island, if you will, from a design requirement standpoint, because they're getting a drawing, they're getting a parts list, they're getting a configuration, and they're building their process around that. But you need to make sure that you're pushing your customer to get involved with your process failure mode effect analysis, because their input helps you to make sure that you've targeted the right PFMEA elements from a occurrence and an impact assessment. And I know that can be difficult at times, but I know we at GE, we're really trying to push hard for suppliers to engage, and we're pushing back to engineering saying, hey, as we walk this journey, let's partner together. So you might find more appetite to be a part of the solution than you have in the past.
Yeah, and one more to add to that, everything Larry absolutely said is correct. The other thing is that, again, another practical example I can give you is that on new engines that we're building, we actually are implementing all of the APQP principles to that, and that includes bringing in suppliers much earlier in the process. And this covered one other question I actually seen that somebody was asking, is it allows you as the supplier to come back and introduce things from your process that maybe you can't meet with the design. Because one thing that we didn't really talk about, and it was really more on the APQP line, is we can have great designs but sometimes producibility issues. And by I would say the customer also implying these same APQP principles on their own processes, and allowing suppliers to be able to comment and bring in concerns about current design, it allows us to change those designs prior to us going into production. So that's why one of the major advantages of APQP itself is getting that feedback loop, because you would have seen when Deb did the APQP webinar that the product design and the process design really need to overlap. So it's not a handoff that here's the design and it's completed. Even with build to print, the idea is that we want to make sure that the build to print drawings are getting out sooner so that feedback can come back to the customer and designs can be updated if required. And that's something that is a work in progress, the same as PPAP is with suppliers. So it's getting better all the time, but it's not a guarantee that what you've already had, obviously, that you've experienced that yet.
Another question. I understand that the creation of the PFEMA should involve a cross-functional team, but which department is usually the owner of the PFEMA?
That's a really good question. I would say that depends on the company. In a lot of cases, the PFMEA, history tells me even in the automotive, might be the owner of it, might be a quality person, but it is usually very engineering-centric as well, manufacturing engineering-centric. So it really is defined by the company, I would say. It doesn't matter who it is as long as that person understands the process that the parts are being made for.
Yeah, and I would just say that roles and responsibility is so key to successful APQP implementation, that if you don't have clearly defined who's going to own, not just PFMEA, but who's going to own each of these tools and each of these phases and toll gates, it's not going to be as successful as you'd like. So PFMEA, absolutely. Either quality or manufacturing engineering are the two answers I hear most often. We try to push manufacturing engineering because they're the ones that really own the success of it. So we try to push ownership where it belongs. But it's really irrelevant to me who owns it as long as the roles and responsibilities are clear of who's accountable and who's responsible.
The next one, I know we do not endorse programs and things that, you know, people would have to go and purchase. As you know, the SCMH and all the guidance is free for your use. But this one asks, do you use a software for the PFEMA or do you use Excel? Because they feel that using Excel gives them a very high workload.
So this is a very common question. I'll tell you, it's the same one that's dealt with by customers as well as suppliers. And even going back through automotive in my history, this question comes up quite often. There are many companies that are doing it in Excel. If you are doing it in Excel, then one of the best ways to mitigate this workload is, as we described, the product and process families, because if you can group things into product and process families, it will reduce the amount of FEMAs that you have, and really then you're only working on the differences between those part families, which is usually fairly small. There are lots of softwares out there. As Sue said, we don't really say which ones are better than others, but a quick search on the internet will result a lot of different results for you, I would say. I have seen some that are very good. They also, some of them out there will tie together not only the PFMEA, but will also have the PFMEA, the process flow, and the control plan all linked together. So if you make an update to one, it would prompt you to update others. So there is definitely software out there for that. I would just tell you to take a look at Core Tools software. If you can also look at the IAQG, so that's the Automotive Industry Action Group. That's where a lot of the automotive group, they have their blue books, as well as they also do training, and they have, I think, endorsed some different softwares. So you could look in those areas, but I think an internet search would give you what you're looking for.
We have another person that's an aeronautical engineer project consultant, PMP certified, and they would like to know if IAQG delivers any certifications about APQP and PPAP frameworks or any related subjects. So maybe we can touch on what we're thinking about.
Okay, so right now, and Sue, you could maybe speak from the SAE side. Right now, we don't have any certifications or training in place. Obviously, we put these webinars in place to get information out there and everything. I do know that there are a number of organizations that now are offering AS 9145 training, and those are certifications. But right now, I know we don't have any specifically set up.
Right. And I work for the IAQG, and I can just say that there's still a lot of talk. There's a lot of discussions about trainings and how we can do this. There's a lot of work happening in your team, the 9145 deployment strategies. So stay tuned is all I can say, is that there's something in the works. And when we know, we will make sure it's published.
Correct.
How is the situation handled where a run does not have enough quantity to be statistically viable? In automotive, less than 1.67 or 1.33 requires 100% inspection and a recovery plan. With small runs, i.e. 25 pieces, you will never be statistically viable to have a CPK index. However, at least one customer is not satisfied with 100% inspection.
So I would say this is more common than just one customer. So this is one of the reasons why the industry teams are in place. So there are industry teams for all of the different specifications out there. Actually, this week we're actually meeting. Larry and I are actually just late for it this morning, but we're meeting for a 3-day offsite for the AS9145 deployment team. So all of these different ones do have things in place, and we are talking about those. Now, from a capability standpoint, I would say that I alluded to aerospace being lower volumes, higher mixes, and that capability can definitely be an issue. So what we should be doing is reporting out what the capabilities are, what actions are being taken. You're correct that 100% inspection is not always a preferred method, and it would also, I guess, looking at my history, it would be the same. In automotive, even at high volume, it was never, I guess, authorized or was never a preferred method to have 100% inspection unless it was guaranteed. So vision systems, torque analysis, items like that where, you know, we had issues of not being able to meet capability, you could actually utilize something like that and a customer could agree to it. Usually a customer would never agree to a visual inspection or some type of a manual inspection, even with a gauge, to be acceptable. So it depends on what the application is. It depends on what is actually being used for the verification. But in the meantime, I would say that PPAP, you're going to be submitting what your results are. If your results don't meet capability, then each individual customer usually will have something in place as to what the steps are. So you'll get an interim approval, but how you move to full approval would have to be decided on a customer basis. I can't speak for all of them.
Who, how, and at what stage to account key characteristics in the process?
So key characteristics are usually conveyed by a customer. So if you're build to print, usually the drawing will have key characteristics identified on it. You may also receive, as I said, if you're build to print, you may receive some other additional information from the customer on characteristics that they want you to verify, either sometimes temporarily, sometimes as part of the permanent process that are not on the drawing. Those would be defined and then would be covered in PPAP. From a standpoint, those are all the ones around customer. However, when we talk about key characteristics, what key characteristics are defined by the supplier? In some cases, the supplier will say, I don't have any key characteristics. I would usually challenge that, although I think there is possibilities where key characteristics may not be the best preferred method for verification. Key characteristics define what in your process helps you to identify that you're going to have issues. So normally a key characteristic is placed on something either to monitor it, to make sure that you are always conforming to it. It's saying it's important. But you can also use a key characteristic on a process feature, for example. So we call them manufacturing KCs. Manufacturing KCs are identified by the supplier, and those are ones that are important that your process is running. You know, for example, certain speeds and feeds of a machine will allow you to have a good surface finish of a product at the end. If you're monitoring those and you know speeds and feeds, then you should know that you're going to get a good result on your inspection for the surface finish at the end. So those can be established by the supplier. And KPCMs, I would say, are very important in any industry, and it's to the supplier's benefit, not just adding additional checks and cost.
Some key characteristics don't lend themselves well to CPK analysis. What is the expectation for capability demonstration when a KC is not a continuous variable, but perhaps more of an attribute?
So there are other means of compliance when something is not it doesn't apply to a standard deviation. It doesn't apply to, there are many different methods. There's ANOVA that we're looking at for short, I would say, less time but more accurate, but it's talking about variables. But there are attribute studies, there's ABA studies, there are lots of other alternative means of compliance if agreed to by the customer. So if you have something that isn't loaning itself to a capability because of a numerical value, I would say then it should just be agreed with the customer what statistical verification is completed.
If key characteristics are not identified during design phase, what is the best course of action?
So if there are no key characteristics defined by a customer, then usually that's meaning that they don't have anything that was defined as a high risk in the design process or in their DFIM or design risk analysis. However, we should always be looking at that, as I just stated around KPCMs, is there anything on the supplier side that is important? So even if it's not conveyed by a customer, I would say you should always look at it from your standpoint, what your high-risk areas are in your process, in your manufacturing processes, to not, because a KC is not necessarily just there as an inspection point. A KC can be added to something in an early part of the process, as I said, so that you know when you get to the end of your process, you're not finding defective product. The whole idea is to add these points in place so that as you go through your manufacturing process, you're identifying them earlier in the process or hopefully before they actually happen. So you prevent the error rather than just identify it.
Okay. With that, we've got someone that asked, can you highlight the process for a quick PPAP update for FAI revision changes when fit, form, function is not affected? Seems we lose time with the confusion between the MSPs and the suppliers for these.
So if I understand the question correctly, they're asking what type of a PPAP do I need to submit with an FAI? So if you have a revision to an FAI, I did list and say that a PPAP should probably be updated as well. Now, a PPAP is always supposed to be a snapshot. The submission is a snapshot of what your current process is. So it depends on what the FAI changed for. You're correct. If it's not fit, form, or function, there may not be a requirement to submit the package. I would say at that time, just ask your customer, and they'll tell you whether to submit a package or not.
All right. This one might give clarification of slide 27. Why MSA is listed under phase 4 on the table while it's showing under phase 3 on the APQP PPAP graph, slide 20.
Sorry, just 1 second. So on slide
27 and 20.
Yeah. So can you repeat the question, please?
So on slide 27, why MSA is listed under phase 4 on the table while it's showing under phase 3 on the APQP PPAP graph, slide 20.
1 second.
We can look into that after if it's something that's just a clarification.
I was going to say, I'm just looking at slide 20 as the design record.
Yeah, I'm not saying on slide 20 as design records. I just had the wrong number.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just save that for after. I wasn't sure if it was something that was an intent thing or not. Could you please elaborate how these steps translate into box build products, software performance, final system performance? And I'm thinking the steps they were talking about is around that same area.
Okay,
also, again, maybe it's not clarified enough.
I was going to say, I don't necessarily understand the question there.
Let's move on to another question. Sorry, if you can clarify that, we'll try again and just add it to the question box. As people have known by now that I'm reading from the question boxes, which is Q&A or question, and not the chats, all of them. In automotive, we submit capability on SC/CC features that have been identified in design. If there are no SC or CC features, what is the default? Again, in automotive, it was up to the supplier to pick V numbers of features to submit capability on. Same in aerospace, or could be a CSR. Lots of acronyms there.
So I would say it's very similar, obviously, as it comes across to aerospace. Obviously, if there are KCs that are identified by the customer, those ones are going to be reported, as you alluded to. In the same token, if there are not, or if there are additionals, I would say the supplier should propose which ones that they would with the customer and just gain agreement. Those can be done earlier, so not everything, and again, this is the difference between APQP and PPAP, is although you're putting a PPAP package together, you know, as we move into phase 4, any of this type of questions or anything else where you identify stuff can happen anytime through your process. So it's your best bet is always to just gain customer agreement earlier on rather than waiting and just submitting it with a PPAP package. I would try to gain those once you have your drawings updated and you've identified what you would like to control. I would just get the blessing of the customer, and then you've got the documented proof that you just put into your PPAP with it, and there'll be no questions. Rather than, I would say, in some cases, if we wait until a PPAP is submitted and then you find that your customer disagrees with what you've picked, then there's delays, obviously, in approvals and everything else like that. So the philosophy of APQP, same as automotive, is to identify this stuff earlier in the process.
So Sue, I have on the screen now the slide I believe that the previous question was asking. So it shows here you can see MSA is aligned with phase 3, and yet on our table we show it at phase 4. I think that was the question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. So I guess let me take this. I would say a good catch. Obviously, we've got lots of different graphs here and everything else like that. MSA, really, if you think about it here, these are the core element timing starts. So we're giving guidance along the bottom track here of a start time when we would expect you to start looking at this. It doesn't mean that the MSA is submitted in this position, but the MSA needs to be completed and approved before we start our initial process capabilities. So if we don't know our measurement system is good, then any measurements that we actually take in our process studies are also going to be questionable. So I would take this as a guideline. There's no perfect, I can't tell you that at 23% that you should start a certain thing. These are guidelines and saying as we walk through this, you should definitely start after the control plans are identified. We know what characteristics we're going to be measuring. Obviously, we need to identify what measurement tools we're using, and once we've identified those, what the measurement system analysis is for those before we start measuring production parts. So there's a little bit of, this is a guidance material of saying when we should start. It's not saying when it has to be submitted or completed here.
Okay. Good point. I'm glad we picked up on that. When the manufacturing can improve CPK as time and experience progress in manufacturing the parts, are small changes made based on learnings from DOEs that improve process control considered as potentially rendering a PPAP invalid and requires reapproval? So,
good question. I will answer this in a very cautious manner. Same as in automotive, the onus is always on the supplier to report changes in their process to the customer. Each customer usually will have some method of identifying how those changes in the process are approved. Whether a PPAP is required or not is really a secondary question after the notification. For example, if you approach your customer with a change, they may or may not say that a PPAP needs to be updated. They may say that you don't need to and that it's current. Or they may ask you to resubmit certain elements, i.e. the initial process capability or the FEMA or something like that. In my history in automotive tells me that if a supplier told a customer about every single change that has a potential impact, the supplier would say, "You'll shut me down." But the same message is always there. The supplier should notify a customer of any of any changes, and then that can be decided between the responsible parties as to whether an update is required. I would say there's not always a PPAP update required to be submitted, but the file would always be updated. So for changes, contact and follow your customers, whatever your customer's policy is.
Okay. I have two questions that I'm going to combine. I think you can answer them together. What is the aerospace plan regarding PPAP flow down to sub-suppliers? And is there any insight into AS9145 being mandated in the future?
So those two kind of go hand in hand, and that is part of the reason that the 9145 deployment team has actually stayed functioning. So normally after an industry standard is released, I would say the team that is working on it, the writing team, would usually dissipate until an update was required. With 9145 being a new standard in aerospace and a lot of question around it, there's been a lot of work with the guidance documents, including, say, these webinars, everything else like that, to try to help to convey these changes in aerospace across all levels of the supply chain. So I think as we move forward, the AS9145, I would expect will change it will have at least minor changes to help align to the aerospace industry further when it comes up for its next review cycle. And the deployment team is continuing to work on that through these webinars, other supply chain management handbook improvements. We're looking at all of the different templates, the checklists, everything that we can to be able to continue to give as much information to suppliers as possible and trying to commonize it across all of the customers to make it easier for suppliers to submit.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Brian, that on the aero engine suppliers team, the ASQ group, if you will, I'm a part of that writing team as well, and we're working actively to commonize requirements across the engines companies, Rolls, Honeywell, Pratt, GE, Safran, not the airframers, Airbus and Boeing, not to exclude them, but the AS9145 is aerospace. The ASQ is engines, and so on the engine side, we are commonizing, and we plan to roll out in 2020 a commitment to adopt the 9145 across the aerospace engines group. So you'll see more on that coming as we publish the industry standard AS 13100 later this year.
Okay. How do you handle company proprietary processes and equipment on process flow, control plan, and PPEMA?
All right, good question. This is one that comes across all industries, but I would say has been more highlighted within aerospace. For proprietary information, it can be handled in many different manners. I would say when a PPAP has to be completed or submitted, there are different avenues and formats for it. If there's a lot of proprietary information between the customer and supplier, they could agree to do a level 4 submission, which would be on-site at the supplier, and any of that proprietary information could be reviewed on-site so that nothing is submitted. So that's one method. There are other ones where a supplier may review certain elements with a WebEx or some type of, conveying it just a one-time that way. So I would say you could agree with your customer on how to handle that best. In some cases, once a supplier and customer have a relationship together, those elements may just not be required for submission if a customer has in the past reviewed and knows that the supplier is completing them as per the requirements, and they validate it prior, then they may actually have it that although the element is applicable, they don't need to see the submission of it. So it's really on a customer-supplier, I say, relationship, and you know, once that relationship is established, then it can be decided. So.
Yeah, this is a topic that everyone in the industry is very sensitive to. And I imagine that there'll be more to come on this, but every organization understands that there is IP involved in proprietary information. So we'll just find a way to work best through that and accomplish the mission is the best thing I can say.
Okay. When to use PPAP and when not to use based on risk analysis?
So same as I guess I did talk about that a little bit, but to elaborate on it, if there is, I would say, no benefit deemed of completing PPAP, this is really something that is a customer decision. So if a customer is demanding PPAP on a part, I would say then it's applicable. However, for example, if you're applying PPAP to your supply base, as the supplier, which a lot of the specification says is to flow it down to all levels of your supply chain. You could use a risk-based decision process to say some simple parts, say standard parts, something like that, may not have PPAP applicability. So as long as you gain customer approval of those, I would say that's perfectly acceptable. But if it's obviously stipulated in part of the agreement, the purchase agreement, then it's applicable unless otherwise that is amended.
This one's a good question. In my point of view, PPAP criteria for approval, interim approval, rejection presented today are not included in 9145. Do you think that it could be possible to add them to 9145? And I figure since you guys are on the team, you might know that this may or may not be a thought.
Yeah, so I would say that is something we can definitely talk about actually in our offsite that we have during these 3 days. We're always trying to look at what the next steps are. I would say that in the next revision of 9145, all of these can be taken into account, and yes, improvements will be made wherever we can. In the same token, further information is included. So the Supply Chain Management Handbook is where our team is pointing everybody to. So there is a manual within there, and the manual aligns to the 9145 and gives very, very good clarification. And we're actually looking at those instructions, I would say, or that supporting material to update it and give as much as possible. So that's also on our docket for what we're reviewing this week, is looking at that. So I would say absolutely yes, but the APQP is really the 9145. You're correct. The PPAP can be expanded, I think, in that phase 4 section, but that would be in a future revision. In the meantime, though, there's that information can be reviewed and updated within the Supply Chain Management Handbook.
And coming down to the last 2 minutes, I have one question. Maybe this might wrap up a few things for us and give you both a chance to add any thoughts you might have in closing. But it says, will there be manuals like there is for automotive, IAQG, for example, for APQP control plan, FMEA, MSA, core tools, etc., released by the controlling organizations? Well, I just wanted to make sure that everybody sees up on the presentation right now, on the screen right now, that the Plan and Manage Section 7 will contains quite a lengthy list of not only the manual itself to explain all of the element cards and how it works, how APQP is implemented, but it has all the templates as well. And we have a few webinars, as you see listed there, that may not be in that section as of yet, but we are working to go through those. For example, the design risk analysis, we have design management, but we don't have the design risk analysis awareness materials. And we're working right now to make that a piece of the guidance that is going to go into the SCMH. So we're building on it. If you're looking for manuals and templates, I would say that they're right here in the SCMH. It is completely free. We're undergoing a major revision. There's a new website, the IAQG.org. It's a more modern website, if you will. And just to get the base started, the SCMH is still the same. You can register for free. And as part of that registration process, you will receive invitations to future webinars. This year, in the next couple months, we're going to be completely revising the SCMH so that it will be easier to move around, to print off the things you want, and to open links embedded in other documents. So there are some improvements coming your way, and you'll have all that material free of charge right there on one site. Is there anything you guys would like to add in closing?
So the only thing I would add really quickly is that from a standpoint of the Blue Books are matching that, I would say right now there is not plans on the SCMH to necessarily have Blue Books. However, as Sue said, there's a lot of information in here, and the guidance material in here equates and equals those. For the engine side of the manufacturing groups, there is, as Larry said, the 13,000 series of documents that's currently released. For example, 13,004 and 13,006, which focus on process flow, FEMA control plan, and then process control as it moves into production. And those are being reworked into a 13,100 to reduce the number of different requirements into just one document with a bunch of guidance documents underneath it. But there's no set plan at this moment, but there is lots of discussion, obviously, on how we do that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just have it as a closing comment. APQP, if it's not on your contract, is coming to a contract or PO near you. I would ask you to embrace it, open your eyes, open your mind, educate yourself, use the resources available, get involved, just be active because it's coming.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Brian, for the presentation today, and as panelists answering all the questions that have come your way. There are many more questions that we didn't quite get to. I will be forwarding them to you, and if we update the Q&As, everybody online will be able to find them under the webinar section. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.